We will continue the course for EPA 608 Universal Certificate. Now we are in core safety. This is the last core of general. Okay, after this we will start in type 1 regulation. Let's finish the safety core, this important core that the safety is number one, that we must take care of it.
In this module, we will take a look at the different safety procedures that need to be followed in HVAC practices.
Technicians need to take care when handling refrigerants because they may be toxic and potentially life-threatening. Liquid refrigerants can cause frostbite because of the low temperatures that they reach. This is why technicians need to wear clothing that covers all parts of the body when handling liquid refrigerant. When handling refrigerants, the following needs to be worn: safety glasses, safety shoes, butyl-lined gloves, and long-sleeve shirt. However, just wearing safety attire does not guarantee safety. Technicians must also follow all the necessary safety precautions when handling refrigerant and related equipment. In HVAC systems, you will often find a circular sight or viewing glass connected to the liquid line. This is a tool that lets the technician see if the refrigerant is in liquid or vapor phase. If the glass is clear on a system that is running, that means the refrigerant is in liquid form. If there are bubbles, the refrigerant is in its vapor phase. Ice or dirt may form on the sight glass due to low temperatures. If this happens, the technician should use an alcohol spray to remove the ice or dirt from the sight glass. Do not chip at the glass to break the ice, and do not use tools to get rid of the ice. Chipping at the glass risks breaking it, which would release refrigerant. This would be considered venting, which is illegal under the EPA Section 608 regulations, which we discussed earlier. If this happens, you'll have a much bigger problem on your hands. Each refrigerant will come with a safety data sheet, SDS. This sheet contains important safety information and is provided for all solvents or chemicals, including refrigerants. A refrigerant's SDS provides special instructions for emergency procedures that are specific to that refrigerant. Technicians need to review this sheet before servicing. This sheet includes specific information on protective equipment, toxicity, first aid, health effects, storage, disposal procedures, and spill procedures.
Which of the following safety gear is not needed when handling refrigerant? Poly-lined gloves, safety glasses, safety shoes, respirated mask not required.
In this module, we discuss the general safety practices that are absolutely essential in this line of work. Safety is always key, and we need to understand the potential dangers and proper handling procedures to avoid serious injury or worse.
Okay, we'll go to the next one. This is safety precautions.
In this module, we will look at the safety precautions we need to follow when interacting with HVAC equipment.
When handling refrigerants, our first priority is always safety. Wearing the correct safety attire is important in preventing frostbite from contact with the refrigerant. However, it is only the first step. Other dangers are falls and electric shocks. Technicians often have to get on ladders to access components, and most of these components have electrical parts. Did you know that the #1 cause of refrigerant-related deaths is actually oxygen deprivation? Technicians work with refrigerant gases, which are odorless and invisible. It can be hard to tell if refrigerant has leaked. Because these refrigerants are denser than oxygen, they sink to the bottom of the room, pushing the oxygen to the top. Picture a lava lamp that is settled, with the dense plasma at the bottom. The oxygen you need to survive floats to the top, leaving you and the dense refrigerant gas at the bottom. If you're unable to access breathable air for too long, you will suffocate. This is why oxygen deprivation is the #1 cause of death for technicians handling refrigerants. If refrigerants are inhaled in high concentrations, they can cause heart irregularities and/or unconsciousness. This is dangerous because losing consciousness in the presence of leaking refrigerant can also lead to oxygen deprivation. For all of these reasons, safety procedures need to be taken seriously. If refrigerants are released in a contained area, you need to either wear a self-contained breathing apparatus or leave the area. If refrigerants are released in a contained area, normal protective gear like safety goggles, butyl-lined gloves, and dust masks may not be sufficient. Self-contained breathing apparatus are heavy-duty equipment designed to specifically prevent oxygen deprivation. If you cannot locate one, you must evacuate the area.
What should you do if a refrigerant is released inside a contained room while you are inside? Leave the room. Okay, wear a mask. Call fire department. Wear a self-contained breathing apparatus. Yeah, that's correct.
If you are pressurizing equipment, you need to verify the equipment's test pressure ratings. This information will be on a nameplate located on the equipment. You should check for the low side test pressure value. If you find corrosion on the body of the relief valve, you must replace the valve. The purpose of the relief valve is to protect against excess pressure in the compressor. If the relief valve is corroded, it will not be able to prevent catastrophic failure in the compressor in the case of too much pressure. That is why the relief valve needs to be replaced if found to be corroded or otherwise damaged. When checking for leaks, technicians should never use oxygen or compressed air to pressurize appliances. This is because oxygen or compressed air can explode when mixed with compressor oil or refrigerants. Oxygen cannot be mixed with oils for this reason. Oxygen also cannot be mixed with any grease, which has similar properties to oil. We learned earlier that the best way to test for leaks is with dry nitrogen. When charging a system with nitrogen, you need to charge through a pressure regulator. This means that you need a relief valve to make sure the pressure is not too high. Prior to pressurizing a system with nitrogen, you should always install a pressure relief valve on the nitrogen cylinder. This valve acts as a safety measure that regulates the pressure of refrigerant coming from the tank. You will also need to make sure that this relief valve is installed downstream of the pressure regulator.
It is safe to use oxygen or compressed air to pressurize a system when checking for leak. False.
In this module, we discuss the safety precautions to follow when performing HVAC practices. Safety is always the first priority. It's important to understand the potential dangers and learn the proper handling procedures to avoid causing injury to ourselves and others. Next, we will discuss specific procedures and things to be aware of when handling refrigerant cylinders.
Handling flammable refrigerants. This is the next one.
In this module, we will look at the different techniques we need to follow while handling flammable refrigerants.
In an earlier module, we learned that there are three flammability classes, 1, 2, and 3. The flammable classes are 2 and 3, with 2 being low flammability and 3 being high flammability. Examples of A3 refrigerants which have low toxicity and high flammability are hydrocarbons. This includes propane, R290, and isobutane, R600A. If a refrigerant is flammable, there are special requirements for the equipment that it is used in. This includes refrigerants in Class 2, low flammability, and Class 3, high flammability. If flammable refrigerant is used, the process tubes and piping that it passes through have to be marked red. Any locations with a service connection to the flammable refrigerant also have to be marked red. These places are marked red so that technicians can take precautions when handling those areas of the equipment. The red marking must extend at least 1 inch in both directions for all process tubes, pipes, and service connections with flammable refrigerants.
Yeah, this one talking about the refrigerants. Okay, let's see. I think it's the network
For
or something.
example, all process tubes, pipes and service connections for propane, R290, and isobutane, R600A, will need to be marked red, with a minimum of 1 inch of color in both directions. When recovering any flammable refrigerant, you have to make sure that your equipment is grounded. Your equipment uses electricity, and we want to minimize the possibility of any charge interacting with the flammable refrigerant. Grounding your equipment will reduce the risk of electrical fires.
Which of the following are measures taking to ensure the safe handling of flammable refrigerant? Okay, ground, electrical equipment, yeah. Placing a fire extinguisher nearby, marking tube, and connection red disconnects the appliances from electricity. Okay, I'm not sure of the last one. Yeah,
With flammable refrigerants, we have to consider their lower flammability limit and upper flammability limit. The lower flammability limit is the lowest concentration of a refrigerant that will cause the refrigerant to sustain a flame. This is because, normally, refrigerant molecules are spread too thin to sustain a flame. If the amount of the refrigerant in the air is less than this limit, the refrigerant will not sustain a flame. The upper flammability limit is the highest concentration at which a refrigerant can sustain a flame. This may seem counterintuitive. How can there be too much refrigerant if it is flammable? Think about it this way. Burning requires oxygen. If there are too many refrigerant molecules, there will not be enough oxygen to sustain the flame until all the refrigerant molecules are burned off. If the concentration is higher than the lower flammability limit and lower than the upper flammability limit, then refrigerant can easily ignite or explode. But, even so, a flame source is still needed for the refrigerant to burn or explode. For example, we know that hydrocarbons are highly flammable. If there is a sufficient concentration of hydrocarbon refrigerant in a space, and there is an ignition source, there will likely be an explosion. That is why it is important that technicians do not use flames near refrigerant cylinders. To reiterate, if you are using flammable refrigerants, do not apply an open flame or steam to a refrigerant cylinder, or cut or weld any refrigerant line when refrigerant is in the unit. These can provide the ignition source that the refrigerant needs to burn or explode.
when is refrigerant likely to ignite? When it is when its concentration is higher than both the lower and upper flammability limit, when its construction is lower than both the lower and upper flammability limit, when its concentration is higher than the lower flammability limit but lower than the upper flammability limit, when its concentration is lower than the lower flammability limit. Yeah, I think this one. Yeah, when its concentration is higher than the lower flammability limit but lower than the upper flammability limit.
In this module, we discuss the various safety procedures to be followed while handling flammable refrigerants. Next, we will discuss specific procedures and things to be aware of when handling refrigerant cylinders.
The next one is handling cylinders.
In this module, we will discuss how to use refrigerant cylinders. We will also discuss specific safety procedures for the different types of cylinders.
Refrigerant cylinders are containers used to hold and store refrigerants. They are also known as refrigerant canisters or refrigerant drums. We need specialized containers to hold refrigerants because refrigerants need to be pressurized, can be highly toxic, can be highly flammable, and can be corrosive. This is why we cannot use just any container to store refrigerant. Because the contents of the containers are pressurized, we need to be careful how we handle and store these cylinders. Cylinders with flammable refrigerants will have a red band on top of the container as well. All of these requirements apply to both disposable cylinders and recovery cylinders. We will discuss these cylinder types in greater detail in later modules.
Why do we need specialized containers to hold refrigerant? Refrigerant is toxic, refrigerant need to be pressurized, refrigerant is flammable, okay, refrigerant is toxic, okay, explosive, incorrect. We need specialized container to hold the refrigerant because it's toxic and flammable and need to be pressurized.
First and foremost, we must make sure that any cylinder with refrigerant should never be heated with a flame. If heating is needed for servicing, you can use a heating blanket instead. If refrigerant cylinders are exposed to flames, this can lead to explosions, which can cause serious injury, refrigerant venting, which is illegal, and decomposition of refrigerant, which turns it into a toxic material. For safety reasons, we need to make sure that all refrigerant cylinders are free of rust and damage, clearly labeled, secured, and stored properly. Before handling refrigerant cylinders, technicians need to make sure that the cylinder is not rusted or damaged in any way. If you see signs of rust or damage, the cylinder is no longer safe to use. For cylinders with rust and damage, you need to retrieve the refrigerant inside the cylinder, then dispose of the damaged cylinder. You can place the retrieved refrigerant in a new cylinder to store it. All refrigerant cylinders need to be clearly labeled with the following information: refrigerant type, for example, R12, chemical name, for example, dichlorodifluoromethane, and UN number, for example, UN 1078. A refrigerant UN number is just like its regular ASHRAE number. The UN number is specific for the international transport of dangerous chemicals. Refrigerant cylinders need to be clearly labeled in order to avoid mixing refrigerants, identify contents for recyclers, and identify the amount of refrigerant for record-keeping purposes. Refrigerant cylinders need to be secured at all times to prevent tipping, falling, and rolling. This can be done using straps that attach to a wall bracket or a cylinder stand. Gas cylinders need to be stored in a place that is dry, cool, and well ventilated. The Department of Transportation, DOT, is a U.S. federal agency. The DOT decides classifications for refrigerant cylinders that are disposable or refillable.
Which of the following is not refrigerant cylinder requirements? Clear labeling, security straps, rusty or corroded body, cool, dry storage area. Yeah, rusty.
In this module, we went over the different types of refrigerant cylinders. We also went over the different safety measures to take when handling refrigerant cylinders.
Okay, so we will go to the next part as disposable cylinders.
In this module, we will discuss how disposable refrigerant cylinders are used and what restrictions apply to them.
Disposable cylinders are single-use containers that are made of steel and cannot be refilled. They contain up to 50 pounds of refrigerant. Disposable containers are designed so that they cannot be refilled. These cylinders use a one-way valve, also called a check valve. The one-way valve allows the refrigerant to flow only out of the container and prevents anything from going into the container. The handle of disposable cylinders surrounds the valve of the cylinder. It's designed this way so that if the cylinder is dropped, the handle will take the brunt of the impact, instead of the valve. This way, it protects the valve from being damaged and releasing the refrigerant. Disposable cylinders are used only for virgin refrigerant. We learned earlier that virgin refrigerant is refrigerant that is newly manufactured. Virgin refrigerant is different than reclaimed refrigerant. Reclaimed refrigerant is processed to the same purity standards and is basically the same as virgin refrigerant. However, reclaimed refrigerant is not stored in disposable cylinders.
Which of the following not an attribute of disposal cylinder? They have one-way valve. The handle surrounds the valve. They can be used for virgin refrigerant. They can be used for reclaimed refrigerant. They cannot be used for reclaimed.
An old industry practice was to standardize the color of disposable cylinders. This was so that technicians could easily recognize the refrigerant type by its cylinder color. As of January 2020, this is no longer the case. We learned earlier that AHRI stands for Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. It is a trade organization that represents the HVAC industry. It was AHRI who had previously set the standard colors for refrigerant cylinders. AHRI is an organization that includes the refrigerant manufacturers who produce these disposable refrigerant cylinders. AHRI revised its standard N to stop the use of different colors to denote different refrigerants on cylinders. This is because more refrigerants are emerging in the industry, so it would have gotten confusing for technicians. More than half of technicians in an AHRI survey found the color designations confusing. So as of January 2020, we no longer use colors to classify different refrigerants. All cylinders now have a light green or gray color. Specifically, this color is RAL 7044. Standardized colors will still be used on printed materials, including the labels that are affixed on the cylinders. If you are disposable cylinder, you must evac cylinder IG, puncture this, finally recycle the metal scrap. If you are disposing of a disposable cylinder, you must evacuate all the refrigerant inside it using a recovery device. You need to make sure that the pressure of the cylinder is 0 psig before scrapping it. After checking that the pressure is 0 psig, you need to puncture the cylinder so that it cannot be reused. You have to puncture the refrigerant cylinder while its one-way valve is open. We do this because a refrigerant cylinder is pressurized. If it is abandoned and left to deteriorate, it can explode and cause injury. After this disposal procedure is completed, you can recycle the used cylinder with other scrap metal.
Which of the following step is not a part of the cylinder disposal procedure? Recycling the cylinder metal, charging the cylinder, yeah, evacuating the cylinder, depressurizing the cylinder,
In this
charging
module,
the
we went over the
cylinder,
procedures
can
to
we
be
charge it?
followed while working with disposable cylinders. We also went over the different safety measures to take to safely dispose disposable cylinders.
Okay, the next part is recovery cylinders.
In this module, we will discuss how recovery cylinders are used. We will also discuss the specific safety procedures to observe while handling recovery cylinders.
Refillable cylinders are called recovery cylinders. They have a gray body and yellow top. Any cylinder that fits this description contains refrigerant that has been recovered. Cylinders used to recover refrigerant have to be specifically designed to allow for refilling. This is because refrigerants are pressurized and can be flammable or corrosive. Recovery cylinders can only be used for one refrigerant. For example, if you use a recovery cylinder for R410A, you can only recover R410A refrigerant with that tank. This is to prevent contamination or mixing of refrigerants. All refillable cylinders under high pressure must be hydrostatically tested. Before testing begins, the refrigerant inside must first be recovered and the cylinder evacuated. The refillable cylinder is then filled with a dyed fluid. This test is done to assess the cylinder's strength and check for leaks. Say you have a cup that is cracked, but you don't know where the crack is. If you fill it with water, you will be able to see where the crack is by checking where the water leaks from. All refillable refrigerant containers must be hydrostatically tested every 5 years.
Cylinder is used to recover refrigerant cannot be refilled.
New or empty
False.
recovery cylinders come pre-charged with dry nitrogen. This is to prevent the cylinder from rusting. This also means that before recovering any refrigerant into the new cylinder, you'll first need to evacuate it to get rid of the dry nitrogen. This step is important because otherwise you'd be mixing your refrigerant with the dry nitrogen in the cylinder.
New recovery cylinders come completely empty. I think, yeah. Oh. New recovery cylinder come charged with dry nitrogen. Yeah. Charged with
When
dry
filling a
nitrogen to
refillable
prevent rusting
container, you must take care to not fill it
and
beyond
oxidation.
80% capacity. This is because the refrigerant is pressurized. If the storage area gets too hot, the pressure inside the cylinder will increase and can cause an explosion. By leaving 20% capacity free, you are letting the refrigerant have wiggle room for that scenario. To reiterate, we want to fill the tank at 80% capacity to prevent explosions in the case of a dramatic pressure increase inside the cylinder. Think about holding a glass of water. If the glass of water is full to the rim, you'll have a hard time moving it anywhere without spilling. But, if you leave about an inch of room, you can move the cup without spilling any water. Now, when we talk about 80% capacity, we're mostly thinking about refrigerant in liquid form. When recovering vapor refrigerant, we have specific tools to help us achieve 80% capacity. When recovering vapor refrigerant into the cylinder, we can control the fill level by using mechanical float devices, electronic shutoff devices, and gross cylinder weight. We cannot use sight glasses to determine fill capacity. Mechanical float devices are also called float switches. They consist of a part that floats when a certain fill level is reached. When used in this scenario, the part rises when the cylinder is at 80% capacity. An electronic shutoff device contains sensors that can tell when a certain threshold has been reached. When 80% capacity has been reached, it stops the recovery. Finally, when recovering vapor refrigerant, we can also weigh the refrigerant cylinder to see how much has been recovered and stop at 80% capacity. The cylinder capacity should be indicated on a sticker on its body. Just multiply this number by 0.8. Don't forget to check the tare weight to account for the cylinder body's weight. When recovering refrigerant, technicians need to clearly label the type of refrigerant and amount of refrigerant. These record-keeping requirements are mandated under Section 608. Properly labeled cylinders are necessary to ensure that refrigerants are not accidentally mixed. The labels also allow recyclers to identify the contents of the cylinders.
The EPA mandates use to include the dot and dot of the refrigerant in the cylinder on the label, type and amount, type and temperature, pressure and temperature, pressure and amount. Oh no, type and
As we
amount.
mentioned before, it is not the
Yeah,
EPA that decides what containers are refillable. It is the Department of Transportation, DOT, that makes this designation. To reiterate, it is the DOT that designates which cylinders are refillable. Only refillable cylinders can be used to transport refrigerant. This is to meet the DOT's own safety requirements on what can be transported. If the cylinder is not designated as refillable, it cannot be used to transport refrigerant. Transporting refrigerant means just moving it from one place to another. This can be as simple as moving it from your house to your friend's house. For any kind of transport, the container of recovered refrigerant must be refillable, or you can be fined by the DOT. In this module, we went over the definition of recovery cylinders. We also went over the different safety measures to take when handling recovery cylinders. If recovering or transporting refrigerant, technicians need to use refillable cylinders, as designated by the DOT. Next, we will take a look at refrigerant shipping.
now the last part is the refrigerant shipping.
In our last module for EPA 608 core, we'll go over the considerations we have to make when shipping refrigerant cylinders.
The Department of Transportation is the federal agency that is in charge of regulating all modes of transport in the U.S. We previously mentioned that the DOT is in charge of regulating refrigerant labels. This is because refrigerants are considered hazardous materials. Since they are hazardous, they pose a safety risk while being transported. As we discussed in the safety modules, refrigerant chemicals can explode and cause injury or worse if not handled properly. The DOT regulates how refrigerants are transported to ensure the safety of the workers who handle them and the general public. All safety information for refrigerant chemicals can be found in their safety data sheets. This used to be known as the Material Safety Data Sheet.
Where can you find safety information on the refrigerant you are handling? Safety information sheet, safety data sheet, material data sheet. Yeah, I think all of above. Oh,
The
safety data
DOT
sheet
requires
only.
that cylinders containing used refrigerant be properly labeled if they are shipped or sent for reclamation. If you are sending recovery cylinders with refrigerant to be reclaimed, the DOT requires that you provide a label containing information on the type of refrigerant it contains, for example R22. This is an example of what you can expect to see on the label of your recovery cylinder. The purpose of labeling is to avoid accidentally mixing refrigerants, allow recyclers to identify cylinder contents, and help technicians and owners with mandatory Section 608 record-keeping requirements.
When sending used refrigerant to be reclaimed, you must use disposable refrigerant cylinder. Okay, disposable. Mm, false. Yeah, only recovery cylinder. What information need to be on the label of container sent to reclamation? Refrigerant type, date manufacture, cylinder type, all of above. Oh,
Before
refrigerant
shipping any
type
refrigerant cylinder, make sure that it is
only.
properly labeled. According to safety regulations, refrigerant cylinders need to be shipped upright. Cylinders also need to be secured to ensure safe transport. When transporting recovered pressurized refrigerant, the DOT requires the use of cylinders designated as refillable. If the cylinder is not designated as refillable, it cannot be used to transport recovered refrigerant that is pressurized. If you are shipping cylinders that contain used refrigerant, the DOT requires that you attach DOT classification tags, as pictured here.
When shipping used refrigerant, which of the following must we do? Attaching DO2 classification tag. Use recovery cylinders. Properly label content. All of above. Yeah. What is the position? Are cylinder of refrigerant generally required to be shipped?
DOT
Right.
classification tags are separated by class and indicate the hazard level of the substance. For example, refrigerant gases would fall under Class 2, which is gases. There are special icons on the tags that indicate whether the gas is flammable or non-flammable. Only recovery cylinders can be used to recover refrigerant. These are the cylinders with a gray body and a yellow top. Other than recovery cylinders, no other types of cylinders can be used to recover refrigerant. For hazard class 2.2 chemicals, which are non-flammable compressed gases, the DOT requires the number of cylinders of each type of gas on the shipping paper.
When shipping refrigerant in hazard class 2.2, what information need to be on the shipping paper? Number of molecules in the cylinder, number of times the refrigerant have been used, number of refrigerants in cylinder, number of cylinder for each gas. I don't remember this one, but I think this. No? Okay. When shipping refrigerants that are classified as hazard class 2.2, the shipping proper must be indicate the number
All
of
state
cylinder
DOTs
of
may
each
have separate
gas.
requirements for shipping refrigerants. Technicians also need to check all state and local laws and regulations when shipping refrigerant chemicals. In this module, we discuss the Department of Transportation's regulations on how refrigerants are shipped and labeled. We also learned that refrigerant cylinders need to ship in an upright position because of their volatile contents. The purpose of these regulations is to ensure the safety of everyone who handles refrigerant cylinders.
Yeah, so in safety, we finish safety equipment, safety precautions, and handling flammable refrigerant, and handling cylinders and disposable cylinders and recovery cylinders and shipping. Let's take the safety quiz. So we finish all the general and we are ready to start to type 1. Let's take the safety quiz. We have here 6 questions. Okay. What information need to be on the label of container sent to reclamation? Refrigerant type, date, manufacturer, cylinder type, all of these. Okay, cylinder type. I don't remember this one, but I think it's refrigerant type. In what position are cylinder of refrigerant generally required to be shipped? Upright. When shipping refrigerant that has been used, which of the following must be done? Attaching DOT classification tag, use recovery cylinder, properly label, all of above. When shipping refrigerant in hazard 2.2, what is the information need to be on the shipping paper? Number of cylinder of each gas. Where can you find any safety related information on the refrigerant you are handling? In safety data sheet. When sending used refrigerant to be reclaimed, you must use disposable refrigerant cylinder. No. Let's try. Let's check the answers. Submit. Okay, submit and finish. Okay, error score is 10 of 10, 100%. We answered all the question correctly. Okay, let's finish review. So now we finished the safety quiz and we finish all the general related to EPA 608 Universal Certificate. We will start in type 1 and 2 and 3. Let's finish this video, and the next video we will study type 1.